Look, most financial decisions don't feel dramatic. They feel small. Do I invest now or wait? Do I take the safer job? Do I sell and lock in gains? It's rarely fireworks, guys. It's usually just spreadsheets and second guessing. But every once in a while, someone makes a decision that changes everything. And I mean everything. Take a look at David Beckham. He once added a small clause to his contract, almost an afterthought. And that one clause turned into hundreds of millions of dollars. Or look at a graffiti artist who said, you know what? I'll take stock instead of cash. That decision made him generationally wealthy. Or the early Amazon investors who looked completely delusional for years, until they didn't. So today, I want to walk through a few of the greatest financial bets of all time. Not because we're trying to copy celebrities, but because there's a pattern here. And once you see it, you start seeing it everywhere. All right, let's start with Beckham. So take a look at David Beckham in 2007. He's a global superstar, massive fame, and playing in Europe at the highest level. And then he signs with the LA Galaxy. Now at the time, everyone focused on the salary. Huge deal, big headlines. Beckham comes to America. It looked like a late career cash grab. But here's the interesting part. Buried in that contract was a clause that gave him the right to buy an MLS expansion team in the future for about $25 million. Now pause for a second. In 2007, Major League Soccer was not what it is today. The TV deals weren't massive, and the global attention wasn't there. Franchise values were relatively modest. So that option, it didn't look like the main event. It looked like a side note. But Beckham wasn't just thinking about salary. He was thinking about ownership. Years later, he exercised that option and became a co-owner of Inter Miami. And today, MLS franchises are valued in the hundreds of millions, some over $1 billion. If you look at Inter Miami itself, it's reportedly worth more than $1 billion today. So think about that. The salary paid him once, but the equity could pay him for decades. And this is the first pattern you start to notice. Most people negotiate for income, but the wealthiest people negotiate for ownership. And that's a very different ballgame. Now let's shift gears. Look at this graffiti artist, David Choe. Mid-2000s. Facebook is still a startup, and it's growing very fast. Sure, but it's not the tech giant we think of today. They bring him in to paint murals at their early headquarters, and he's offered cash. And instead of saying, great, I'll take the check, he says, I'll take the stock. Now imagine explaining that to your friends at the time. You're turning down guaranteed money for shares in a startup? That sounds reckless. Startups fail constantly. Most never go public, and most disappear. But here's what he understood. If Facebook failed, okay, he lost a paycheck. But if Facebook succeeded, the upside was massive. That's asymmetric upside, limited downside, and huge potential upside. And when Facebook eventually went public, his stake reportedly turned into hundreds of millions of dollars from painting walls. And look, this isn't about gambling on every startup you hear about. It's about recognizing when the upside is disproportionately large compared to the risk. Most people optimize for certainty, but wealth often comes from carefully chosen upside. Now let's talk about Amazon. And let's go back to 1997. Amazon goes public as an online bookstore. And that's it, just books. There were no profits. There were tons of skepticism. Analysts calling it wildly overvalued. Now imagine you buy some shares, and then the dot-com crash hits. The stock drops over 90%. I'm talking 90%. Most people would have sold. And honestly, most people did. And that's the part that never makes the highlight reel. Because holding through years of volatility, looking wrong, and feeling wrong, but the investors who held and who believed in the long-term vision experienced one of the greatest compounding stories in modern history. The key wasn't perfect timing, it was conviction. And conviction usually feels uncomfortable. The best financial decisions often look foolish at the beginning. If everyone agrees it's a great idea, the upside is usually already gone. Now let's zoom out to corporate scale and look at Disney in 2009. They buy Marvel for about $4 billion. At the time, that sounded expensive. Comic book characters, $4 billion? There were no guarantees superhero movies would dominate for the next decade. But Disney wasn't buying last year's revenue. They were buying intellectual property. We're talking about characters and storylines, a whole universe that could expand across movies, merchandise, theme parks, streaming, everything. And since then, the Marvel Cinematic Universe has generated tens of billions in global revenue. What looked expensive became strategic. Sometimes the smartest financial move isn't about paying the lowest price. It's really about understanding scale. If something can compound culturally and financially for decades, the upfront number starts to look small. So what's the common thread here? Look at Beckham. He saw ownership instead of just salary. Look at David Choe. He saw stocks instead of just cash. And look at early Amazon investors. They saw infrastructure, not just an online bookstore. Look at Disney. They saw a universe, not comic books. So what is this? They all required patience. And they all required risk tolerance. And they all require thinking differently than the crowd. Now here's where this becomes personal. You might not be negotiating a billion-dollar deal, but you will face smaller versions of these decisions. Do you take the higher salary or the role with equity? Do you sell when things get volatile or hold because your long-term thesis hasn't changed? Do you optimize for comfort or for leverage? The lesson here isn't to gamble. It's to understand leverage when it shows up. Because most financial decisions feel small. But every once in a while, one decision really does change everything. And when that moment comes, it probably won't feel obvious. It'll definitely feel uncertain. Maybe a little risky, maybe even a little crazy, but that's usually where the upside lives. Now, if you enjoyed this breakdown, do me a favor, hit the like button. It really helps the channel and tells me you want more content like this. And if you're serious about building wealth thoughtfully and not hype or gambling, but real strategy, go ahead and subscribe. I'll put out new videos every week breaking down money, investing, and the psychology behind smart financial decisions. So thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.